The numbers associated with the growing costs of the National Disability Insurance Scheme are huge, growing faster than any other budget item except interest on the national debt. The NDIS has transformed lives, but the costs are not sustainable. Disabilities Minister Bill Shorten announced a reboot of the scheme today. He joins me now from Canberra. Bill Shorten, welcome to 7:30.
Good evening, Sarah.
Now, on current figures, the NDIS will cost $50 billion by 2026. Was it ever envisaged by you and the other creators of the scheme that the NDIS could become more expensive than Medicare or the funding of hospitals?
Well, first of all, I don't accept the proposition you're raising. Not that it's growing in cost, it absolutely is. But when I talk about the NDIS, I never imagined that we would be able to make the life-changing impact that we can on people. So that's where I start from. And in talking to you and talking to your listeners, I just want to reassure people with disability, they get triggered every time there's a discussion about the scheme because they've got the muscle memory of the last 10 years of Conservative government who always talk about cutting it. I believe, and I announced today, measures in consultation with the board of the NDIA and the review we've got underway and people with disability, that we can hit that sweet spot. We can thread the needle of reform. We can help put downward pressure on some of the inflationary costs in the scheme, but we do it by prioritising the best interests of the participant first. That's the way we do reform.
I understand that that message needs to go to participants in the NDIS, and I'm sure they've heard that. At the same time, do you have an estimate of how much mismanagement and fraud are costing the scheme's budget?
Well, I do think it's actually pretty significant. One regret I have over the last 10 years is that the previous government, to put it politely, were negligent in the way they ran the scheme. We used to say in opposition that the NDIS had a welcome mat out the back door. In other words, the government would make it hard for legitimate people to get into the scheme, but there wasn't sufficient oversight of invoices and some of the scams. I've discovered there wasn't a welcome mat. There was no back wall to the scheme. So we've already introduced fraud detection, and now we're talking about how do we have a better run scheme, investing in the capability of the agency and its people. How do we move to long-term plans? Here's a classic example of what drives costs beyond just unethical behaviour. When you have an annual plan, every family just worries as they approach 12 months, have we spent our money? What's going to happen in the next plan? If we had longer-term plans, then people focus outwardly rather than the perverse incentive of always worrying about the next increase in the plan.
Let me just... I beg your pardon. The point is made about the long-term plans, but do you have an idea how much in budgetary terms mismanagement and fraud are costing? Just a number. Do you have an idea?
It's billions of dollars. Estimates have ranged up to 10% of the scheme. I think when you look at what I now call unethical behaviour, that covers the range from out-and-out crime through to overcharging, over-servicing. There is a culture in Australia, and the NDIS suffers from it, that some people think when they provide services to someone else, if that person has a government package, in this case an NDIS package, some people just think you can charge the person more. What that does is denies the participant chews up money out of their budget, and it denies them perhaps other things they need. I know you can go online right now, and if you want to get a wheelchair, or if you want to get a shower seat in a shower, if you say you have NDIS, the price triples and quadruples. So there's the crooks, but there's also over-servicing. There's also I worry about junk therapies.
Yes.
But the problem is, whenever I talk about the negative, and they're your questions, so I've got to answer them honestly and directly. I also have to say that for hundreds of thousands of people in the scheme, they're up for these changes. They want predictability. They wanted not to be treated as human ATMs. They wanted to be treated humanely, but also by government too. Now,
a couple of times you've blamed the 10 years of the coalition government, but isn't there also a question here that costs blew out because many more people joined the scheme than was expected?
Well, there's no doubt that before the scheme was established, disability in Australia was a catastrophe. It was teetering on the brink of disaster. I mean, it's no exaggeration. The Shutout report of 2009, the Productivity Commission report of 2011, said that the old way of funding disability had to stop. Basically, before the NDIS, the only way you could really get supports is if you were in a bigger disaster tomorrow than you were today, and if you're in an even bigger disaster next week, then you're more likely to get resources. Allocating scarce resources to people on the basis of getting more into crisis is a dumb way to run a system. Having said that, there was a lot of unmet need, and the scheme has certainly had to deal with larger than expected entry into it. Also, a challenge is that the NDIS is almost a victim of its own success. It's like the only lifeboat in the ocean.
I read an extraordinary figure today that 200 Australians are joining the program each day, and those numbers are going to go up. Just tell me this though: what is the Treasurer expecting you to do? What is the NDIS budget number that he wants you to reach? We've heard a lot about these very big numbers. They're almost too big to take in. What does the Treasurer want you to hit in terms of an NDIS budget number that is sustainable?
The Treasurer hasn't given a number, and we'll see on budget night, and I won't steal Jim's thunder, there's only 20 sleeps to go. But he is like the Prime Minister and the rest of the Cabinet and the Labor government. We want to see a scheme run properly, that every dollar gets through to the people for whom it was designed. I truly believe that we can have a much better NDIS. It's here to stay. I want to make that very clear to people. But I think if we prioritise through the filter of the best interests of the participant, then all of a sudden we eliminate the unethical behaviour. We eliminate some of the short-termism. We also need to make sure that states and other departments step up. So, yes, does he want me to help provide a reform agenda which puts the NDIS on a sustainable footing for future generations? Absolutely. But the nice thing about Prime Minister Albanese is they let their ministers be their ministers. As far as I know, I don't think the Prime Minister's appointed another disability minister at the same time.
Will you be looking again at categories of disability briefly? Can you tell me whether that's something that's going to happen? Which people, which categories of condition will be eligible for cover?
Well, the scheme was designed for people with disability, not particularly on diagnosis, but on how whether or not their impairment was severe and permanent. What happened is that in the previous government, they started just using diagnosis-based definitions to get into the scheme. I think that's unfortunate because what's happening, for instance, if you've got a beautiful little child with a developmental delay and there's not enough support for developmental delays outside the NDIS, the diagnosis is putting people into the scheme, not in a bad way. It's just saying that this is where the child can get the support, that's where I want the child. But the NDIS was never designed for every Australian with a disability. So what we have to do is have a conversation with the states. We have to have a conversation with other departments and say, hey, we cannot create independence and a better outcome for people with disability just through the NDIS alone.
I think the states have made it pretty well. At least some of the states already have made it clear that they don't think that they have the capacity to take on a larger share of the funding at the moment.
Well, far be it from me to famously get between a premier and a bucket of money, but I don't think that's right. But there'll be others who'll negotiate that. I'll do them the courtesy of not negotiating through the mediation of ABC Compare, but they do need to step up. And when I say step up, it's not necessarily in dramatic or surprising ways. A lot of states are doing quite a bit. Transport accessibility, support for kids with disabilities in schools. The NDIS isn't the reserve education system. Community mental health, it can't just be sorted out by hospitals or by the NDIS.
And just briefly, Bill Shorten, give us a timeline, just briefly, how quickly can we expect to see these reforms paying off in terms of that extraordinary trajectory of budget?
Hopefully in the next 2 to 4 years. There we go. That was proof I can give short answers.
There you go, 2 to 4 years. Bill Shorten, I appreciate it's an enormous task. I take the point about the participants in the NDIS. We respect that. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.